My name is Shri Kumar, and I write under the pen name K.S. Nair, primarily on the subjects of Indian military, aviation, and maritime history. So in early 1942, No. 1 Squadron and a few other detachments of the Indian Air Force had come back to India from Burma as they were pushed out of Burma by the Japanese. Thankfully, the Japanese paused for the year, at least as far as the land campaign through Burma was concerned. They'd probably outrun their own supply lines. But a little later in 1942, around April, May 1942, there was a major naval battle in the Indian Ocean and the Bay of Bengal when the Imperial Japanese Navy's first air fleet, which is the same supercarrier task force which had bombed Pearl Harbor, that same group of aircraft carriers came into the Indian Ocean and started sailing up towards the Bay of Bengal. They attacked Ceylon, they raided Madras and Vizag, and there was a scare that they would come all the way up to Calcutta. So this happened almost exactly between Pearl Harbor, where these 6 Japanese supercarriers had blown the American fleet out of the water, and Midway, a battle which took place in mid-1942 in the Pacific Ocean. And almost exactly halfway between Pearl Harbor and Midway, the Japanese aircraft carrier force was attacking Ceylon and India. And the Indian Air Force had a tiny role in spotting the Japanese fleet as they came into the Indian Ocean and the Bay of Bengal. It's almost unimaginable because the Indian Air Force aircraft which spotted the Japanese fleet were Wapitis. These are biplane aircraft, partly made with fabric covering, not even all metal aircraft. And these were the Indian Air Force aircraft that spotted parts of the Japanese fleet that were coming into the Indian Ocean and the Bay of Bengal. It took unimaginable courage to fly those flimsy and old aircraft against the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Imperial Japanese Navy deploying the Zero fighter, which is one of the most effective fighters of that period. And I think the Indian pilots who flew Wapitis against the Japanese were lucky that they didn't encounter Zeros. Apart from the retreat from Burma and the peripheral involvement in the Japanese raids into the Indian Ocean, the Indian Air Force did not actually see too much action in 1942. It was a period of consolidation, and 4 more new Indian Air Force squadrons were raised, or at least the raising was initiated towards the end of 1942. So the Indian Air Force had taken 7 years to go from 1 flight to 1 squadron. And then in a couple of years, they'd gone from 1 squadron to 3 squadrons. And then in the year 1942, they went from 3 squadrons to 7 squadrons. And apart from that, the Allies had finally started to invest significantly in improving infrastructure in India. The number of airfields in India went up from about 10 to 200 over the period from 1942 to 1943. And there were major investments in improving the port facilities in Bombay, Madras, Calcutta, and also in Trincomalee. As it happens, Trincomalee in Ceylon was actually treated as the major entry port for Madras Presidency. The British Raj, as you know, was divided into 3 what they call presidencies: the Bombay Presidency, the Bengal Presidency, and the Madras Presidency. And Trincomalee in Ceylon was actually regarded as the major port of the Madras Presidency. So these investments actually transformed India's infrastructure. It wasn't completely a positive story for India. A lot of the airfield construction was done by acquiring land at very, very short notice. And Indian villages were sometimes cleared almost overnight notice from the government saying that land is needed for new airfields. But it did actually transform India's ability to support aviation. nearly every modern aerodrome in India, nearly every modern airport in India is actually built on the site of one of those 200 World War II airfields. So the infrastructure of India, both the port infrastructure as well as the airfield infrastructure, was completely transformed over the period 1942 to 1943. And that really happened because of World War II. I think towards the end of 1943, the Allies started planning to go back into Burma. Burma remained hugely important, not only because it was the westernmost limit of Japan's advance during the war, and from a geostrategic point of view, it's possible to imagine a scenario. The Germans had almost reached Egypt in North Africa. The Germans from their bases in Europe had come into North Africa at the western end of North Africa, and then they pushed steadily eastwards towards Egypt, and they had almost reached Egypt. And from the other side of India, the Japanese had reached the borders of India in Burma. And it is possible to imagine a scenario when the Germans pushing eastwards from Egypt and the Japanese pressing westwards from Burma could have linked up somewhere in between. And that would have transformed World War II. We would all be speaking a different language today, probably. But as it happens, in 1943, the Allies started to look at going back into Burma. Burma was important not only as it represented the westernmost point of the Japanese advance, but also because Burma was the major supply line to China. The position of China in the Asian theater of war was somewhat analogous to the position of the Soviet Union in the European theater of the war. Throughout the period from 1941 to 1943-44, in Europe, Russia was the only Allied country that was actively fighting Germany on a continental scale and was tying down more than half the German army. Similarly, in Asia, during the period 1941 to 1943-44, China was the only country that was actively engaging in a continent-sized land battle against Japan. And they were tying down about half of Japan's army. So it was just as it was crucially important to the Allies to send supplies to the Soviet Union to keep them fighting during World War II, it was equally important to send supplies to China to keep China fighting and tying down half of Japan's army during World War II. Now, it's important to remember that China at that time was very different from China as it is today. Territorially, it was only about 70% the size of modern China. China of that era did not include Outer Mongolia, did not include Tibet, and did not include the areas that are now called Xinjiang, the Xinjiang provinces of China. So it was a smaller country, and it was governed by a non-communist coalition which called themselves the Nationalist Chinese Party, right? Under Chiang Kai-shek, the generalissimo of the Chinese. Right? The Chinese Communist Party played very little role in fighting Japan at that time, although they've started trying to reclaim that role now. But be that as it may, I think the point is that Burma was important largely because of the need to keep China fighting against Japan and tying down half of her army. So in late 1943, the Allies started preparing to launch back into Burma. And this was a major campaign in the Asian theater involving more than 1 million troops on the ground and 30 to 40 squadrons of Air Force aircraft. And through most of the next year, 7 to 9 of those 30 to 40 squadrons were Indian. So late 1943, the Indian Air Force has built itself up quite rapidly over the previous year from 3 squadrons to 7 squadrons. And late 1943, the first 2 of them go into action in Burma. Initially, they're fighting down the coastal part of Burma, what's called the Arakan coast at that time. The Arakan coast at that time is now Rakhine state of modern Burma, modern Myanmar. The first battles were down the Arakan coast. The Arakan campaign itself went through about 3 cycles of advance and retreat, and then advance again. And there were 2 Indian squadrons fighting there, and flying with great distinction. The commanding officer of one of those squadrons, number 6 squadron, commanding officer, squadron leader Nair became the first Indian to be decorated, the first Indian aviator to be decorated with the DSO, the Distinguished Service Order, which is an even higher decoration than the DFC. The DSO was at that time the 2nd highest gallantry award for the British, second only to the Victoria Cross. Right? So Nair Singh became the first Indian aviator to be decorated with the DSO during the Arakan campaign. But just as the Arakan campaign was getting into its stride, the Japanese launched a major counterattack in what was called the Central Front of Burma. The Arakan Front is to the south. The Central Front is where Burma faces what was then Assam and is now largely Manipur and Nagaland. So the Japanese in around May of 1944 launched a major offensive into central Burma. The 3 great Japanese divisions fought their way to within a stone's throw of the plains of Assam. And the 2 places where the decisive battles were fought, which are quite close to each other and related to each other, are the towns of Imphal in Manipur and Kohima. Right? Now, the battles of Imphal and Kohima are now regarded as Britain's greatest land battle. A few years ago, a survey was conducted among professional military historians and military personnel about what Britain's historically greatest land battle had been. And Imphal and Kohima emerged as Britain's most significant land battle. The battle where a previously defeated Allied army had turned the tables on its enemy and achieved a victory that was exploited to enormous strategic effect. The battles of Imphal and Kohima were among the most bitterly fought battles of the Second World War, and there were 4 Indian Air Force squadrons flying in that battle. The 4 Indian Air Force squadrons included number 1 squadron again. Number 1 squadron was at this time commanded by yet another iconic commanding officer, was at that time squadron leader Arjun Singh, who's very familiar because he was still with us till just a few years ago. Arjun Singh commanded number 1 squadron in the Battle of Imphal, flying out of airstrips cut into the valley of the Imphal Valley, and led his 15 Hurricanes so brilliantly. Arjun Singh is one of the most iconic of the recipients of the DFC in the Indian Air Force, and he's received an honor from the British that very few foreigners ever have. He was invited back to Cranwell, which he himself had graduated from 50 years earlier. He was invited back to Cranwell to take the salute at the passing out parade of a Royal Air Force batch in the 1990s. Arjun Singh made his name commanding number 1 squadron at the battles of Imphal and Kohima. There were 2 other Indian Air Force Hurricane squadrons flying in the battles of Imphal and Kohima, and 1 squadron flying a relatively unknown aircraft type called the Wapiti Vengeance. The Wapiti Vengeance is an American dive bomber aircraft, but it was never actually operated by the Americans. Right? It was operated primarily by the Indian Air Force and the Australian Air Force in the China, Burma, India, and the Papua New Guinea theaters of war. And the Indian Air Force operated it with great gusto. And the squadron which operated Vengeances in the Imphal-Kohima theatre was number 7 Squadron of the Indian Air Force, which is commanded by another very iconic Indian officer called P.C. Lal, who would also go on to become Chief of the Indian Air Force soon after Arjun Singh. The battles of Imphal and Kohima are now regarded as Britain's most significant land battle. But at that time, there was very little coverage of them in the British press. And the reason is that in June 1944, the Western Allies, particularly the British, Canadians, and Americans, had crossed the Channel and launched the D-Day operation, which was the most spectacular military operation that up to that time in the Second World War. And the newspaper reports, the media reports of the D-Day landings back in France overshadowed the news from Asia about Imphal and Kohima. So at the time, Imphal and Kohima were hardly covered in the British press. And it's a tribute to their sense of history that Imphal and Kohima today have been recognized as strategic as they are now. For the rest of 1944, it's probably good to go back to Burma. Once the victory had been accomplished in Imphal and Kohima, the Allies launched a major operation to reconquer Burma. So they went back into Burma from north to south, down the Irrawaddy River, crossing the Chindwin River. These were all places that they had been chased out of in 1941, 1942. And they were going back now victorious with a much larger army and a much better equipped and prepared army and air force behind them. And by this time, there were 9 Indian Air Force squadrons participating in the operations. And 2 of them followed the army thrust down the spine of Burma, heading for Rangoon. This campaign lasted well into 1945, and there was some particular urgency about it because it was imperative that they reach Rangoon before the monsoon started. The monsoon starts in Burma by about May. So from late 1944 into early 1945, the army was moving was trying to move as fast as it could southwards through Burma and capture Rangoon before the monsoon broke. And the Air Force units were following them equally fast, and they were moving from one airstrip to another as the army units moved south. That same squadron, it's the number 7 squadron, followed the army all the way up to Rangoon. And interestingly, they reached Rangoon on or around the 8th of May 1945. That was exactly the same day that Germany surrendered in Europe. Actually, capturing Rangoon was a bit of an anticlimax in some ways because there were indications from a day or two before that the Japanese had withdrawn from Rangoon and left it empty. There's a fantastic story about how the Japanese had abandoned the prisoners of war in Rangoon Central Jail, and the prisoners of war, from somewhere or other, procured buckets of whitewash, and they wrote on the roofs of the prison, "Japs gone," and also an obscenity. And the obscenity was intended to make it clear that this was not a Japanese deception tactic. Anyway, in May 1945, as I say, the Allies reached Rangoon. It was actually almost the same day that Germany surrendered in Europe, so what's called VE Day. But in the Burma campaign, they hardly noticed because they were more concerned with what was happening in Rangoon. Because the Allied troops in Burma were all too aware that Japan hadn't surrendered yet, and Japan was still one of the most tenacious and tough fighters in defense. As it happens, P.C. Lal received a DFC for his leadership of 7 Squadron during this period. And P.C. Lal's was the last of the 25 or so DFCs that were awarded to the Indian Air Force during World War II. The war in Burma continued for a couple of months, and as Burma was cleared, the Japanese were withdrawing into Malaya and other parts of Southeast Asia. The British and Allied forces in Burma were actually preparing for an invasion of Malaya. The plans had all been laid out, and it was called Operation Zipper. And it was almost on the same scale as D-Day in Europe. The Supreme Commander in Southeast Asia at that time was Lord Mountbatten, and he saw Operation Zipper as his big crowning glory of an operation. And he wanted it to be as big as D-Day had been. Now, as it happens, as we all know, in early August 1945, the Americans dropped 2 atom bombs on Japan. The awesome power and spectacle of the atom bomb accomplished what years of defeat had not done. It broke Japan's spirit to resist. And Japan surrendered on the 15th of August. As it happens, one of the Indian Air Force Squadron, number 8 Squadron, which we've talked about before, number 8 Squadron was the first Indian Air Force Squadron to start operating Spitfires. Number 8 Squadron had since about June of 1945 been operating in Mingaladon, which was the airfield for Rangoon, the capital of Burma. And Rangoon was the location for one of the preliminary surrender agreements. So 8th Squadron of the Indian Air Force actually escorted the Japanese aircraft carrying the Japanese generals who were to sign that preliminary surrender agreement into Rangoon. 8th Squadron personnel were on hand as the Japanese delegates disembarked from that aircraft. They were escorted into Jubilee Hall, a landmark building in Rangoon of the time, which had been constructed for the Golden Jubilee of Queen Victoria's reign. And it's a spectacularly beautiful building, or was. It's been demolished now. And was the venue for that preliminary surrender agreement. And many Indian Air Force personnel crowded into the upstairs galleries of of Jubilee Hall to watch the signing of that surrender agreement. The Indian Air Force also contributed 1 squadron to the British Commonwealth Occupation Force, which occupied Japan for 2 years under General Douglas MacArthur. We did send 1 Indian judge to the Tokyo trials, who was a member of the tribunal of the Tokyo trials. So the Indian judge was called Judge Binod Pal, and he is still regarded with a lot of respect in Japan. So that, by and large, is the story, a very summarized story of the Indian Air Force in World War II. I've tried to tell part of that story in my most recent book, The Forgotten Few. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about my old schoolboy fascinations, which have lasted for so many decades.